the heads play again.
God.
Can you imagine?
Is that actually?
Yeah, it's
No
totally
shot.
accurate. No, I'm not kidding.
Fucking wild.
God damn, you should play the lottery. I swear.
Look at the boy go right there. That boy is a good guy to own it.
God.
Wait, hold on.
Wait, what?
Vince.
Oh, jeez.
This is Brock.
was in
Me and Mark
I-
have intel. We actually want Brock
100%. 100% not Brock. 100% not Brock.
It had to be.
back. Well,
Yeah, it
actually,
had to be.
101% Brock, and my percentage
to
is
be.
higher.
What
Yeah,
about
it had to
100?
be.
What about 101.1%? It was
No,
not
like
Brock.
116%.
Oh
Brock.
God, he went 116. That's kind of wild. We might have to vote Moo now.
Brock is just.
Brock, kid, I need a sidebar
Like,
after
no,
this.
There's only
I
like
think-
one way this couldn't have been Brock, and I'm not gonna say
It's
it's
not
not
Brock. It's
Brock.
not Brock.
the
It's not
entire
Brock. It's
round.
Brock.
It has to have been Brock.
It's not Brock.
There's no way.
It's not Brock.
I don't think you
It's
guys
not
understand. We have irrefutable evidence which we cannot disclose for our own protection.
with me
that
and Gid
Lou
the
is
entire
bad.
round.
I
He was
was
with
I
me.
love you guys.
You should know who did this.
And why is Hammy dead? If you're with him the whole game, then why is Hammy dead?
I'm
Yeah, I
gonna
don't
skip.
know. Brock knows it's
I'm
fun.
with
You
you.
just
Yeah.
get the
You
entire
don't know,
round.
huh? You don't know.
You should have an
He's
answer.
good,
Who
he's
did
good,
this?
he's good.
I don't know.
It was in Lights Cage.
Doesn't know.
I
guys.
feel bad
I
now.
was
I feel bad
a-
now.
And I
I
was
don't-
amnesiac. I took this role. It's a good role. It's a crewmate role.
Can confirm she's not
Hey,
lying.
if you got sheriff, can you
Wow.
sheriff shoot Moo, please?
I did not get sheriff.
You probably did because Bonza probably sheriff shot himself. But Moo is bad. We've irrefutable.
then that would be
irrefutable
bad.
evidence.
No.
What?
Moo is
Tell me
not
the
bad.
proof. Tell it to me.
If I give you the proof, it will ruin me.
Oh my
I will be
God.
ruined.
my god. Are you right for the wrong reasons again?
Oh, I'm right for the right reasons.
Yeah, he knows.
Yep.
And I
You
trust
know that
him.
TikTok song? He knows. Oh,
I trust
he
him.
knows.
Moo is
Yeah.
seriously
Wait,
not there.
wait,
Wherever
no,
you
no,
are,
come
Moo
here,
is not.
come here.
They're gonna
I'm
know.
more shocked that you.
Alright, where's the sheriff? Sheriff shoot Brock. Sheriff shoot Brock.
Sheriff
Sheriff shoot Brock,
shoot
please.
Brock. $5 if you sheriff shoot Brock.
Oh, hold up. Right?
Oh my god.
5 gifted and a handy.
Oh, I wish I had. God damn it! I wish I was sheriff.
Oh, well, then you're useless to me.
I got you.
This does not feel like a safe place.
I don't like this. What have I done? What have I done? What have I done? Oh, fuck.
Cause chaos. I don't know who the imposters would be.
Wait, someone was in here. Come out! I don't know.
Funny.
Oh my god! Oh, I just know he's
Wait,
not
so
gonna.
bad. He was that.
Oh,
that man.
poor
The
Moo.
sheriff?
Dude, I feel
Not
so
sure,
bad for
but-
Moo right now.
You shouldn't.
I feel bad for him too.
I
he
honestly
shouldn't have
thought
did what he
Gid
done.
was gonna kill me, and that's why I veteran by Gid. And then I went to go check to see if it was on cam, and then Moo tried to kill me.
Really?
I just want to know now what he did.
Okay, now I feel bad. I feel bad.
Yeah.
We are not good people, Wildcat. We are bad people.
You're not. That's what you're right, Tina.
Okay, fuck it. Just vote me out. Just vote me out. I got Brock killed. I got Brock killed. Just vote me out. Just vote me out.
You go by
They
that.
didn't-
15-pin D-sub connector, which itself is unusual for use with video. It's the same physical connector found on the Apple IIgs and the Macintosh. However, all three of these are incompatible with each other. The video signals on the 2C, however, are the strangest, and I'll confess right now that I don't even understand what half of these signals actually do. Interestingly enough, the laser only shares these pins in common with the 2C's video port. I'm told that these are all that are required to operate the external LCD screen, but I've never actually seen one operating on a laser before, so I can't guarantee it will work. But the laser instead adds these signals to the port. You may notice the more familiar red, blue, and green signals, along with intensity, and the various sync signals. Now, if you think this looks a lot like the standard RGBI signal used by things like IBM CGA or the Commodore 128, you'd be right. So the signal is compatible, but the physical port is not, so you need some way to convert it. So I'm going to set up my Tandy monitor, which is strictly an RGB monitor, and I have this little adapter here made by Adrian Black that he was kind enough to ship to me. So I'll just plug in the Tandy monitor right here, and then plug the adapter right into the Laser 128. So let's power it on and give it a try. Here's the Oregon Trail. And how about Castle Wolfenstein? Interestingly enough, the color RGB, the text is even more rainbow, but the colors of the castle are far more solid and the edges are sharper. Now, let's go back to the Oregon Trail. Now, this one's more interesting. They're using a wider font, which helps reduce the color artifacts on the composite monitor. But looking at this on the RGB monitor, the font is perfect, as are the graphics. However, here's an issue. When you look at the sky, it's clearly blue, and yet when you look at the RGB monitor, it's more of a cyan color. This is likely due to the fact that the 16 colors of an RGB monitor are fixed, and they had to map the 16 colors from the Apple to the RGB colors the best they could. But again, look at the difference in the text here. It's just so clear on the RGB monitor. The amazing thing is, this feature would have cost several $100s at the time as an add-on card for your regular Apple II computer, and it's built right into the Laser 128. In fact, a better way to see the difference in clarity would be to show off something that works in 80 columns mode, like Apple works, which brings us to the next feature to talk about. In the era, they usually required an add-on card to get 80 columns. The Laser 128 essentially came built in with the equivalent of an 80 column card. So for example, if you wanted to run something like AppleWorks or any other 80 column software, it could handle that just fine. One neat feature you might notice is that the original Apple character set contains these Apple symbols, the open Apple and closed Apple, which can be used in software to represent the modifier keys here on the keyboard. But the Apple logo was trademarked by Apple, so the Laser used the open and closed triangle instead on the keyboard, and they also replaced those characters in the ROM with triangles too. So if you're running something like AppleWorks, it will actually show the correct key to use on screen, which I think was pretty clever. But let's compare how 80 columns looks on composite versus RGB. I mean, the composite version is readable, and it would look even better on a monochrome monitor, but this is a color monitor, and this is what you'd have to deal with if you wanted color. Now let's have a look at the RGB. Now this is where it really shines. It delivers the same crisp 80 columns you'd expect on a monochrome monitor, but this is a color monitor. Admittedly, I can get a little bit better display from the composite monitor if I turn up the brightness a little, but it's still blurry by comparison. Moving on to another feature, the Laser also has this row of function keys, but the Apple architecture doesn't really have function keys, so what do these do? Well, my understanding is these are just mapped to various control key combinations. So sort of like how they gave us a break key over here, which just maps to Control C as far as the Apple software is concerned. These all do similar things. And one other way that the laser was better than Apple is that it was faster. Well, sort of. There were multiple versions of the Laser 128. This is what the first version looked like. I have the revision that came after that, but mine is still considered just a regular Laser 128. But there was also an EX and an EX2 version. These had faster processors that could be configured to run at 1 MHz for compatibility, 2.3 MHz, or 3.6 MHz, so almost 4 times faster than an original Apple II. Now, one of the things that was required to make this work was to put some dedicated video RAM on the motherboard and shadow that RAM to the main RAM. Now, this was necessary because in the regular Apple II, access to the RAM alternates from the CPU and the video circuit. You can't just increase the speed of the CPU because the video timing is mandatory as it has to run in sync with the video display. So that's the reason for the extra RAM on the board, so that the video RAM can operate independently. So I've read in numerous places that the Laser 128 has its own graphics modes that were potentially superior to the standard Apple graphics modes. However, I haven't found any actual evidence to support this. I haven't found any example programs to demonstrate it. I haven't found any example source code to show how to program it or how to activate these modes. And I think this myth is possibly perpetuated by some magazine articles that had a misunderstanding of the architecture. It probably boiled down to the fact that it has its own video RAM and it has that RGB mode that is, kind of non-standard for Apple. And so maybe they just assumed that was its own standard video modes, or there was some kind of confusion there. That's my guess. However, if it turns out I'm wrong and you have proof that it does have its own video mode, then please send me an email and I'll put an update in the description field letting everybody else know. One other important feature that the Laser had over the Apple IIc is that it was somewhat expandable. If you look at the side here, you may notice an expansion slot. Now, this port is almost identical to the slots you'll find inside of an Apple II. Laser sold an expansion chassis that would fit on the side and could hold 2 cards, which would map to slot 5 and 7 on a regular Apple II. However, these are nearly impossible to find. Apparently some cards will work by just sliding them into the side like this and letting them hang out. However, the only thing I have on hand is a mucky board, and it doesn't appear to function in that manner for mine. However, I saw somebody on one of the discussion groups saying they had tried it in their Laser 128EX and it worked fine. But in theory, if I had the expansion case, I could definitely use a mocking board with this, which is something the IIc cannot do. Well, there is a modern mocking board for the IIc that's quite a bit more involved to install, but you know what I mean. The Laser 128 could accept regular Apple II expansion cards, whereas the IIc could not. And the last thing I want to mention that made the Laser 128 a better computer than the Apple is its price. It was cheaper. Originally, the Apple IIc retailed for $1,295. You could buy the Laser for $479. That's right, almost 3 times cheaper for a product that actually does more. Now, you can imagine Apple must have been really annoyed by this. Originally, the Laser 128 was sold mail order only. Magazine advertisements were one of the most common methods to spread awareness. The largest retailer in the USA was Central Point Software, and at some point VTech actually bought Central Point Software and continued to use them to distribute the computer. However, eventually some retailers such as Sears started to sell the Laser. In fact, you can see it here in this 1987 Sears catalog for sale for just $3.99. The headline is Apple IIe or C compatible Laser 128. It was important to mention that because Laser had no brand recognition with the general public. If you look closely, you'll see the regular 128 was $3.99 and the EX model was $4.99, so they were selling both units. It's also interesting that it was shown here with an RGB color monitor. And it says order connecting cable below. And there's some cables listed at the bottom here for like $16 or $17. One of these must have been the RGB adapter. And on the next page of the Sears catalog, you'll see they're selling the IBM compatible Laser Compact XT for $4.99. And here it is. Notice that it looks almost identical to the Laser 128, but that's really about all it has in common is the appearance. The Laser 128 is not particularly rare. I mean, you can go to eBay and type in Laser 128 on any given day. You'll probably find at least 2 or 3 of these up for sale. So they are available. The Laser XT, on the other hand, now these things are rare as unicorns. And while it looks almost identical to the Laser 128, it's not an Apple clone at all. It's actually a clone of the IBM PC. Okay, so let's talk about some of the interesting things here on the back. First of all, you have this huge connector here. This is for an external drive, and yeah, finding one of these today is pretty darn difficult. It's probably difficult even back in the day. Then we have your standard parallel printer. Joystick, which was actually kind of an unusual thing to be built into a low-end PC machine of some kind, because that was typically on a card. Composite and RGB, which we'll talk about in a minute, and a mono color switch. Over here we have a standard RS-232 port, which was 25 pin, pretty common of the era. And then of course we've got that same physical port that the Laser 128 and the Apple IIc have, but it's wired completely different and is of course not compatible. The weird thing is there's also a power out, which, was not terribly uncommon for the time. A lot of computers would have a special place for the monitor to get power. The weird part is this is the only power going into this port here is DC power. So that means the only thing they would have available here is also DC power. So I'm not sure what kind of monitor would have ever plugged into that. I've never seen anything that would plug into that. So that's quite interesting. And of course, over on the side, we've got your regular 360K disk drive and a power switch. So notice we have power switch here, but on the Laser 128, this is where we had the volume and headphone jack. There is no volume and headphone jack on the XT. And you may, of course, notice the Laser 128 has a bus expansion port over here where there is nothing on the XT. No sort of cards can be installed. So let's go ahead and boot this thing up. One interesting thing is that when we power up the computer, the boot screen actually shows the BIOS is made by Central Point Software, so this must have been after the acquisition by VTech. Of course, most anything you do with this computer will require booting an MS-DOS disk first, and I think the first thing we should do is try out some games. I'll start with California games. I've tried the more color mode, which is kind of a little trick that it can do, but it just doesn't seem to work on this computer, so we'll have to do number one. So what we're looking at here is the standard 4-color CGA mode on an RGB monitor. California Games uses different palettes for different screens to give it a little bit of variety, but ultimately this computer is pretty much a stock CGA system. Here's Planet X3 running in 4-color CGA, or how about Thexter? So as I mentioned earlier, the computer also has a composite out, and as most of you know by now, CGA was capable of 16 colors on composite. Unfortunately, very few games actually supported this, and most were very early CGA games, like California Games. And so what I'll do here is I'll set up the composite monitor for another comparison, and here's California Games in 16 colors. Pretty much everything about this game looks better in composite mode. Here's another Indy 500. Unfortunately, the CPU is barely capable of running this game. And of course, my own game, Planet X3, also supports it, but now I want to show you the big problem with it. I booted up the computer 3 different times, and as you can see, the colors came out different each time. In fact, none of these are the correct palette. Now, unlike the official CGA card from IBM, it seems a lot of clones didn't lock the color burst signal to the correct place on boot up, and it could wind up at random locations. And the Laser is quite guilty of this. That's actually one of the reasons I put this color palette switcher in the game, which can help to a certain extent, which means the composite mode isn't all that useful, and in most cases games would appear in 4-color CGA mode. I also want to talk about this color mono switch. It sort of does the same thing as on the Laser 128, but here on the XT, it only affects the composite output. RGB is totally unaffected. But even on composite, it's kind of weird. Watch this. I'm going to flick it to mono. And well, the monitor is still trying to display color. It's like there's still color signal there, but not quite. So everything is just an artifact color. I can put this Apple monitor into mono mode, and it seems that toggling the switch is doing more than just killing the color signal. It actually changes the way the pixels are displayed. Kind of interesting. Anyway, I'm sure the purpose behind this would be to get the best picture possible when connected to a monochrome composite monitor. Really, about the only feature that this computer had over a standard IBM XT is the turbo mode. By default, it boots up to the standard 4.77 MHz, but you can press Control 5 or Control 8 to toggle speeds. And the turbo LED will light up to let you know you're in turbo mode. I'm not quite sure how fast it is in turbo mode, but I'm guessing 7.1 MHz. You can actually see the difference in speed just by listing the directory. Here's in regular mode, and now in turbo mode. Unfortunately, even with turbo on, games like Indy 500 just barely run. Of course, the biggest problem with this computer is storage. It was really difficult finding software to demonstrate on this thing that would work with a single floppy drive. Some programs would quite literally complain that it required 2 floppy drives or a hard drive to work. There's a lot of software that technically would run on this computer if only it had a hard drive. Even by 1987, most all IBM clones had at least 2 floppy drives or a single floppy with a hard drive. And while you could get an external floppy drive to fit this weird port, I would imagine finding it would be a problem, and by the time you paid for that, you might as well have just gotten the larger Laser XT desktop computer, which had all the expandability you need. So I think the reason that the XT is harder to find today is because I don't think it actually sold as many units as the Laser 128. The question is why, and I think the answer could probably be boiled down to a couple of things. First of all, the Laser 128 was about the only game in town. As far as Apple clones go, there weren't a lot of other Apple clones, actually more or less no Apple clones out there besides the Laser 128. Plus, it was better than an Apple in so many ways and way cheaper. It was a bargain. So it's kind of a no-brainer why people would flock to the Laser 128 if you were in the market for an Apple clone. But the Compact XT had to compete with other IBM clones, which were ubiquitous by this point. Everybody was making IBM clones, and it was especially difficult for them to compete with companies like Tandy or Compaq, who were making very inexpensive and very well-equipped PC clones. Anyway, the last thing I want to say about these lasers, and particularly about the Laser 128, is they seem to be pretty reliable. Now, I realize this is just anecdotal evidence, but everybody I know that has one, it works perfectly and has never needed to repair, including this one. Now, I can't say that about the XT because I actually did have to repair this one. In fact, I did a whole video on that a couple of years ago. But, you know, with such a small sample size, it's really difficult to draw any conclusions from that. But I think that overall, these laser machines were pretty reliable. Anyway, I hope you enjoyed learning about these laser machines, and I guess that's it for this episode. So, as always, thanks for watching. Hello and welcome back to the 8-Bit Guy. This is an unplanned episode, and let me tell you how this began. So my friend Rob, you know him as the Obsolete Geek, was traveling in Canton, Texas. Now, Canton is a good bit away from the Dallas-Fort Worth area. I consider it to be in the middle of nowhere, but they are well known for their flea markets that they have on a regular basis. And so Rob goes out there and he looks for vintage computer equipment. Most of the time he doesn't find anything, but you know, sometimes he does. Then he came across this VIC-20, and I mean, as you can see, it is in horrible condition, and the seller only wanted $5 for it, and so he decided to pick it up and see if maybe I would consider trying to restore it. And so, you know, and here it is. It is, oh man, it's gross just to touch this thing. This is absolutely, without a doubt, the worst condition VIC-20 I have ever seen. But I'm going to go further than that and say it might actually be the worst condition computer, period, that I've ever seen. And that says a lot because I used to work in an industrial environment in the IT department, and I would have to go out in the shop all the time and work on these computers, and the dust, the atmosphere in the shop would just be full of, I would call it shop dust or metal dust. It's basically just dust that comes from welding or grinding, and it's just mostly iron, I think, but it would just collect all over everything and get inside of the computers. It would just settle on the motherboards. It was terrible, but you could usually just blow it off with some compressed air and it would be more or less fine. This is different, and while yes, it does have a lot of dust on it, if you look at the back of this thing and you look in through like the cartridge and the user port and you see the actual motherboard inside, it is it's got like some kind of nasty black oil or grease or something just all over it. And I haven't even taken this thing apart yet, so I'm not sure what I'm gonna find when I open this thing up. I'll tell you right now, I don't even know for sure if it's repairable. I have not even tried powering this thing on, and I'm not even going to dare try to power it on until I've at least taken it apart and examined it and maybe cleaned it a little bit. So anyway,